So I'd like to talk about something that is almost as primitive as breathing in terms of our lives every day, which may be surprising at first glance. But creativity and creating is fundamental to our survival. There's hardly a circumstance that we face in the course of our day that is fully predicted or predictable. And so we meet it and make some original decision to go right or to go left. And however trivial that creative act, it's new and it matters to us when we do it or we wouldn't do it. And occasionally those creative acts lead to a creative thing. And that may be a pirouette, it may be a book. And again, it's something that matters to us when we make it or we wouldn't make it. Now, our survival, neuroscience and other forms of science show pretty clearly, has been correlated with our ability not only to create things that matter to us individually, but to our clan or to those around us. And we do better on average when we think about the interest of others, although you might not gather that from some of the media you see today. And that leads to a very different kind of creative process that obviously involves dialogue, listening, collaborating, and pooling of resources. And over the course of history, that kind of creating, of course, has led to villages that have lasted for very long periods of time, to things like wheels, to pyramids, to shoes, many, many things, obviously. And that's fundamentally one of the reasons why civilization has emerged. Now, if you fast forward to our circumstances today, in many ways, this is a moment, sort of a crowning achievement of human creativity. If you have read Steven Pinker's recent book on Enlightenment Now, it's a kind of a tour de force of the accomplishments of human creativity and how the human condition in so many ways is, in general, better than it has ever been on the planet. On the other hand, the created things that we've made, if you look at these images or just look around you, are remarkably short-lived. And the reason for that is a couple-fold. One, among the things that we have too little of in life is time. And so in general, it's always been true that when we could make something of value in a short period of time, as opposed to a long period of time, we've favored making it quickly. And of course, over the last few centuries, and maybe especially over the last 50 years, the emergence of modern science and technology has put into our hands a power to make things of massive scale very rapidly that bring value to many in a very short period of time. And that has led, of course, to the world that we live in today. And it's also really shaped what we think of when we think of creativity and innovation. Now, my book is about creating things over a long term, creating things that matter not just for you, but to many others and for a very long period of time. I try to highlight a process that is very uncommon today in our business schools, in our corporations, in the cultural understanding of creativity. And I take as an environmental context the scientific lab, which is in a way the prototype of a creative environment and in many ways responsible for much of the creation around us. And I'd just like to analyze what goes on in that science lab for a moment. Of course, there's a scientific method, and in general, we're exploring phenomena whose laws we understand, framed by conditions that are perfectly well-defined, and we then perform experiments, make observations, and deduce from those observations phenomena and discover. The reality is that much of what goes on in science labs, and particularly pioneering labs where we're doing something new, involves either phenomena that are not perfectly well understood or conditions that are not perfectly well defined, and therefore involves another process that is not exactly the scientific method. It's intuitive, it's inductive, it's imaginative, it's comfortable with uncertainty and ambiguity, and it's, if anything, is a process, an artistic process that coexists with the scientific process. And so in pioneering labs, you generally see this combination of imagination and deduction, analytical, and imaginative processes that, frankly, not only happen in science labs, but they happen in culinary labs, they happen in our own personal lives as we go about our lives in a very experimental way. There's some combination of art and science, and so the lab is a really interesting context for how we create and ultimately what we create. Now, I'd like to talk a moment about those things that we create, just to illustrate something fundamental that's changed about creation over the last 30 years, and also finally about learning. So if you think about our creation in two extremes. On one extreme, we're creating things that are relatively mindless, and it could be the drawing we make on a fog-covered window, just a quick little sketch, and we haven't thought very carefully about it, and we're not really aiming to express something to many, and it will disappear very quickly. And compared to that, there's a circumstance of a parent who's died, and we have a first letter to write, and it's a profound experience that's changed us, and we haven't fully analyzed it. And in writing that idea, we're expressing something of ourselves, and it's something that matters deeply to us, and that it be expressed in a perfect way matters deeply to us. And so we write that in a very different way. We create that in a very different way than we create that little drawing on the window. Now, my book talks mostly about this latter kind of mindful creation, and there has been a stream of thought since the early 20th century that these kinds of works, whether it's a formula, a theorem, or a relief, are aesthetic works. And I talk about that in my book. And if you look at aesthetic works over the last 3,000 years, or even beyond that, you see that for most of human history, created works, whether they're plays or paintings or reliefs, tend to invite a certain kind of reaction and interaction with the observer or the audience. They express an experience and invite an observation, whether it's in a library or in a theater or in a classroom or in a museum, and in many ways are expressing values and beliefs, at least in terms of a cultural work, that are learned, and then we move on from the theater or from the school. And that's generally how we've set up our organizations, cultural, academic, and even our commercial enterprises in this way where creation is made, the public sort of learns from it and benefits from it, and then moves on. Now, that kind of creation has radically changed in the last few decades. And while I'll talk here about the exhibition of Olafur Eliasson in 2004 at the Tate Modern, just to drive this home, if you take many of the products that are important to us today, they invite not only observation, but interaction, and our interaction changes them. Okay, so we're kind of co-creating many of the things, frankly, from the clothes that we wear to the internet sites that we engage in, to the technology that we use. These things are evolving in a way that the reliefs in the past did not evolve. And if you look in works of culture, it's really exactly the same thing. And so this work, the Weather Project in 2004 at the Tate Modern, Olafur created this kind of sun, and people came in to observe. And it was not really obvious how people would interact with this work. And they ended up lying on the ground and making all kinds of patterns. And it became this experiment, really, that has become, again, one of the great contemporary works of art. But it's illustrating the fact that what's happening in learning today and in cultural exchange is that the wall between the creator and the public is going away. And that it's becoming increasingly difficult to receive commercial value or to learn and not to co-create. Okay, and so that really changes how we think about learning at a place like Harvard University or just learning in general. And one of the main foci of my book is how do we learn to create a world that we all want to live in? And that was really one of the reasons why about 13 years ago I left Harvard and went to Paris and opened a new cultural center. And at that time, there were a few new kinds of cultural labs that were being created in Europe, in London, and Dublin, and in Paris, where we were looking to create environments where art, contemporary art and design were being used to create a public dialogue around frontiers of science. And so I've been interested in the last 12 or 13 years in creating environments where we learn at frontiers in a way as kids learn at frontiers, I'll talk a little bit more about. And from that learning, we create things, we create cultural value, and ultimately create things that matter. Just talk a little bit about that. So kids are the ultimate pioneers, if you think about it. They're dealing both biologically and in pretty much every other way with extremely new circumstances. And one of the things I just want to point out is that not only are they learning at a really massive rate, but they're also having fun in a healthy childhood, at least. And one of the points that I make in the book is that while making a world that we all want to live in is very, very difficult, it's very, very risky, but it needs to be fun. Because if it's not going to be fun, we're not going to do it. And that's one of the things that we don't talk enough about, that the creator life, the pioneering creator life, although looked from afar, it seems like a very, again, risky thing to do. At some fundamental level, for reasons I'll explain briefly, is inherently fun. Our biology has made it pleasurable for us to create value in circumstances where we fundamentally need it. And so more concretely in my book, I'm highlighting the creative lives of pioneering creators in the arts and sciences and food and technology, and ultimately looking at how these creators who make things that matter, who make things that last and bring value to many for a long period of time, how they create in very, very similar ways. And through this creation, in a way, curate or develop or learn emotive and cognitive states that help them survive. And how, in the process, they actually have fun in a certain way or derive pleasure. Now, just to give you an example of the kind of creator I highlight and a sense of what those cognitive emotive states are. David Doubilet is one of the great marine photographers, and he invented the split lens camera that allows you to see, take a picture of life above and below the water, and it was really a fundamental invention that helped us all grasp the fact that this is one world. And I was speaking to David and asking him, you know, David, when you go diving, how do you choose a buddy? How do you choose a buddy? And so one of the things I talk a lot about in the book is the fact that when you pioneer, you generally don't pioneer alone. Even though you think about pioneering as being something solitary, the reality is that diving deep in the sea without a buddy is not a good idea. You want to have with you when you're pioneering people who care about you and who think about you. And your survival really goes up when you have other people who want you to survive. And so David said, well, the second most important thing, is interesting, is that they be kind. The worst thing is to go diving and risking your life without somebody who's not a good person. And this, well, of course, I said, well, then what's the first thing? And he said, well, the first thing is that they be passionately curious, right? When it comes to pioneering, if you're not waking up in the morning and like passionately curious about your day, well, you're not going to last for very long at the frontier. And so those are two of the cognitive and emotive states that in my book I show how biologically those states develop and have evolved to allow us to survive in these kinds of pioneering conditions. Now, one of the creators I want to highlight here, only because this process is sort of easy to understand, is Ferran Adrià, chef of El Bulli just outside of Barcelona, which closed in 2011, but arguably the greatest chef of our time. And Ferran, in the course of his career at El Bulli, never repeated a dish. And so 1,846 dishes, everyone different. And so he created new things. The book is really fundamentally about creating something radically new. Not the next phone, but something that just has never really been created before. One thing I want to point out is when you're creating something really, really new, you want to make it beautiful. And the reason you do is that why would anybody care about this thing that nobody has ever experienced before if it doesn't have some kind of an aesthetic attraction? And so if you look at the created works of pioneering creators like Ferrand, they tend to give a great deal of attention to aesthetics. They sort of ennoble the experimental act of the audience or the public that engages in this thing that has never existed before. So I show in the book that all creators create in a cycle. And so this design here on the book is what I call the creator cycle. And it's a 3-step process that is quite familiar to all of you. And it's actually fundamentally related to the reward system of our brains. Our brains have sort of made it interesting to us and rewarding to us to sort of discover and to create value. And more specifically, there are 3 key processes in the reward system in our brain. One is related to wanting, one is related to reinforcement learning, and one is related to liking. And so I give an example in the book, and just really briefly, of the student who is needing to read Anna Karenina, say, for an exam and has never read Leo Tolstoy. And so she wants to read Leo Tolstoy and is sort of motivated to read Leo Tolstoy. And so she picks up Anna Karenina, begins to read it, and there's this reinforcement learning of reading. She actually does like reading Anna Karenina. And then when she's done, she's talking about this book with her partner that she loves, and both the book and the partner, and there's this conversation, this sort of exhibition that leads her to understand even better Anna Karenina, and she goes back to read War and Peace or whatever it is. And so there's this sort of process of discovery that we all are familiar with that actually our brains have made interesting to us. Every step along the way is interesting to us. It's actually an enjoyable process, right? And so this is exactly what happens in long-term creation. Long-term creation has to be fun or enjoyable, or we're not going to do it. We'll be looking for the payday, right? But the people who are creating for a very long period of time, they're actually enjoying the process. And they do that by having a rapid cycle of ideating, experimenting, and exhibiting. And they're in environments that allow them to bring what they're making, even in prototypical ways, to audiences that get it, that consume it in a certain way, and they all learn. And so they're bringing value, but they're in this sort of creator cycle loop. And that's pretty obvious when it comes to a chef like Ferran Adrià, but I show how this is common to scientists and inventors and artists alike. And what I point out in the book is that there are this set of, I identify 7 cognitive and emotive states, and I'm really referring to the left column, that are critical to survival and success in pioneering creation. And I contrast them here to qualities that are equally critical in a different kind of creating, which is actually quite important. We think of it more as a competitive creating. And it's obviously super important, frankly, in a successful artistic life as in a successful commercial or scientific life. But it's something that I'm not really focusing on in this book, but I do want to contrast it. So let me just talk for a second about this left column, that these qualities, which are described in much greater detail in the book, I mentioned curiosity, empathy, but intuition, innocence, humility, happy to talk about any of these, aesthetic intelligence and obsession. All of these, of course, would be very unhelpful in the competitive process of bringing an idea to market and growing a business, for example, but are really critical in the discovery of something that has never existed before. And so what becomes challenging and critical in the creative environments that we make to really make things that go out and change how people think and live is that we create environments that allow for the coexistence of the pioneering spirit and the competitive spirit. And I talk quite a bit about that in the book. But I do focus mostly on this left column, and I just want to point out that in creating this world that we all want to live in, while the created things matter, mostly how we create matters, right? In a way, this world we all want to live in starts today. And if you think about, well, what are the neighbors I want to, who are the neighbors I want to live with? I think that, or the children, maybe I am hoping to raise, the qualities of pioneering creation are really fundamental humanistic qualities that are fundamental to our survival. And so I think that, in what I argue in my book, these qualities that are taught much less today than they might have been taught several hundred years ago, just given the acceleration of creation and the short-termism of creation, for all the reasons that we know, are really critical not only to creating these things that matter, that will sustain the human condition, but also actually enjoying the process. And so in the last part of the book, I talk about what I think is the most important emergent creative process of the last 10 years, and it's this grassroots creator movement. And I've been talking quite a bit with JD before the talk about this, and just to highlight this for a minute, in 2005, 2006, first tweet, first Maker Faire, Maker Magazine, the beginning of this grassroots expressive creator movement. So for most of human history, it was a very few people on Earth who were creating things expressively that would last beyond the moment of their articulation. So it was a very small group of people. In the last 10 years, between the user-generated content online and all kinds of maker activities, from 3D printing to food making and pottery, all kinds of grassroots creator movement forms, we now have literally 2 billion, at least 2 billion people expressing themselves daily. And we may appreciate that expression, we may not. It may be hurtful, it may be spiteful. But the fact that people are creating things expressively out of personal experience, mostly not for making money, mostly not for making a name for themselves, although that all happens, but actually expressing themselves in ways that endure and that other people can hear, that's important. And what I point out in this book, and what is exciting, is that while it's a confusing movement, and a lot of people, there's a lot of critique of the maker movement in terms of its ultimate value, it's really changing how we work, and I think it will ultimately change how we live. And one of the things that you see going on, and I analyze it in my book, is that there are these emergent kinds of self-associations that are going on in the grassroots creator movement. And in fact, if you look at something like WeWork and how we, companies are starting to reorganize themselves, very, very much a consequence of this grassroots creator movement. But these self-associations are happening in schools, around projects, they're happening on weekends, around sort of maker events, they're happening in Habitat for Humanity, humanitarian kinds of, people are coming together to create, very much like you're all coming together here. And it was fascinating, again, just listening to the speakers before I spoke. You're coming here because you want to. Nobody told you to come here, and you're coming here partly, it may be less in a creative mode, but in many cases in a creative mode, like these pictures I'm sharing. And it's not that there's necessarily the aim to make something that will sell or something that will be a great work of art, but there's something learned. There's something fundamental that's learned. And I point out in the book that those qualities of passion and empathy and even humility are the very qualities that are learned in these environments. And so at Harvard University, I think in learning environments around the world, we're beginning to look at that and say, well, how do we reorganize ourselves? Frankly, how does a Google reorganize itself? So that we're not only creating things that matter to our business today, but we're creating kind of a soil that will matter to all of us over a very long period of time. So in my book, and I will stop and open up for questions in just a few minutes, I talk about how we take this emerging expressive movement, which is really taking creation and the responsibility for creation out of the hands of the CEOs and the heads of government and putting it in all of our hands. How do we point it to the big issues of our time, right? The 17 Sustainable Development Goals are an example of those big issues. And particularly, I give some examples of work that I do in these kinds of environments. And this gets to these culture labs that we've been creating. And while this is the one that I started in Paris and is now in Cambridge, there are many others that are in cities and universities around the world at this point. And I just want to point out that in our case of the lab, in moving the lab to Cambridge in 2014, we started and held for the first time a couple years ago something called the World Frontiers Forum. And I just talk briefly about the forum. The forum is one of these attempts to capture the energy of this grassroots creator movement, and it brings leaders from around the world with leaders from the UN to experience 15 Frontiers of Tomorrow, and not just hear talks, but actually experience this open-ended spirit that I'm describing of pioneering creation from contemporary art to biology, and in the midst of it, act. And so there's a project in the midst of this that has an artist in the center of it called a Convergence Project. And the forum, which happened for the first time in Cambridge these last 2 years, will be taking place in Europe next year. And these kinds of gatherings where not only do we come together to talk, but we actually find a way to act on some of the big issues of our time, I think are the sorts of reorganized creator movement activities that will be really playing out over these next years. So the book is really about how do we go back to making something as fundamental as the wheel, and do so in a way that's just coherent with how our biology has evolved in pioneering conditions. So with that, I'd like to really open this up to questions. I could talk a little bit more about some of the things I do, but I think I'm much more interested in just hearing your thoughts and talking about creating with you. Thank you.